Okay, everybody, we are really excited to join you today to talk about learning to love mergers and acquisitions. And in conjunction with that, learning to do what to do with identity. What do I do with all these disparate identity environments that we've created as a result of merging organizations, eating one up, maybe spinning one off, having a lot of these interchanges of what's important and not important around who's here and who's not. This is a great opportunity for us to talk about what do we do with that. So we're going to focus this conversation today on how do you deal with your identity environment when you have a little bit of a mess and you need to deal with it. So the two people here are myself, Nathan Lozanowski. I'm Concurrency's Chief Technology Officer. I would love to connect with you on LinkedIn. I produce a lot of content surrounding innovation, around IT strategy, CIO strategy. There's a weekly newsletter that I think you get a lot of value from. So please connect, please follow on LinkedIn. Love to be in your sort of social relationship network to be an asset to you. And then Kurt, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit?
I'd love to. Thank you, Nathan. I'm Kurt Spitzner, Delivery Director here at Concurrency, and in the middle of really a lot of these projects where we make it happen from a merger and acquisition standpoint. And like Nate said, today we'll focus on identity, which often is the kind of the entry point to have a discussion about merging or divesting environments. And we've been at it for a while here at Concurrency and have really come up with some strong team to deliver on these types of projects and love to help customers with these challenges. So like Nate, scan my QR, let's connect on LinkedIn. And if there's any questions during or following the webinar, I'd love to connect.
Awesome, thank you. All right, so what are we going to do here today? First thing we're going to do is frame up the M&A story a little bit, give you some perspective of what we see at the 30,000 foot level. It's definitely become an interesting space. There's a lot happening, a lot of different ways people are engaging in partnership relationships or mergers or spin-offs. So I want you to have some understanding of how to look at it big picture. But then we're going to focus most of our time on how to handle identity and the options. It's definitely changed in the last couple of years. What is the normative model of integration? What are options for non-integration? We want you to have some picture of that. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how to get organized and taking action on your M&A identity-oriented journey. So the first question I would ask is, what is your current M&A identity state and where do you want it to be? So I'm going to launch a poll so I can get a little bit of bead on where most of you are sitting. I think I'm going to have a good guess, but I'm going to put that poll out there. Give me a little responses on that. Submit those. Okay, actually pretty equal. I was totally expecting it to be mostly sitting in the, we have some consolidated and some not, but I see there's some that are totally consolidated but planning upcoming M&A. I see that there are some that are some consolidated, some not, and then we have some that are, we got a lot of upcoming stuff we got to take care of because we haven't really fixed our problem that we had at all. So glad to see the diversity there. Awesome. Okay, so what we are going to start with is just talking about the different types of M&As that we typically see in organizations. And the first of those is where you are taking one organization that exists as one whole and you're splitting it into two. And that is what we will call a divestiture or a spin-off, sometimes what's called a spinco, where you're taking that A company and you're making it into an A and a B company. The really interesting thing about those projects is the B company has the opportunity to do everything right from the ground up. Usually they're setting up a new identity, a new forest, a new synchronization of their user accounts. They get to kind of clean up everything that you had wanted to clean up. But what it leaves behind is all that B stuff in the A organization. And A sometimes gets left holding the stick. They're like in a position where they have to do that cleanup of their org, and they want to have some modernization too. So it is an opportunity to think about where they can go with the opportunity to be able to not only spin off B, but also make A better. So we can talk a little bit about that as we go. The second is carve out, where you are you have an organization, it's sort of adopting A's components, but B sort of ceases to exist. The full company acquisition, which is probably the most normal of these, where you have an A company and a B company, and they are becoming the new A company, or the A company that's eating it up is sort of like greater as a result of the whole, but maybe they get a new name, maybe it gets pivoted to have a new brand because it's now encompassing a broader diversity of organizations. And then the last of these is this sort of merger of equals scenario. In the mergers of equals scenarios where like you totally have two organizations that are at the same playing field. Like one is equal to the other. Neither one of them is really like eating up the other in a sense. And then they have to figure out like what that new organization actually looks like. And sometimes this one in particular is one where an organization truly ends up having a new name, a new brand, a new capability. It's not even close to ones where you're sitting up in this this sort of acquisition space where like it's a 10,000 user company that ate up a 500 user company, for example, or full company acquisition where it's a little bit closer to a pivot. Merger of equals is like, hey, we've got two 10,000 user organizations that are coming together and we're not even sure who's leading. Like we had two CIOs both sort of jockeying for the same positions, which creates a lot of sort of political questions and who are people's staff sticking around types of questions. So all of these sort of fit into the picture we'll be talking about today. All of them have their own complexities, and all of them give opportunity to be able to address the IT environment. Kurt, any perspective on these?
Yeah, one of the things that I was going to bring up, and it's one of the things that we find on all four of these, is that in many situations, the excitement around the acquisition, the divestiture, the business or financial opportunity leads the way. And it can leave these IT decisions that we're going to help step you through as overlooked, or we feel like we're late to the party. It's not uncommon, and it's a place where we're able to kind of catch things, having seen these in all different ways, and help organizations work through how we might be able to solve for that IT need. Because in the bigger picture of the financial transaction that's happening, it often can get left behind or maybe glossed over. As we get into the rest of the content, we'll talk about how you can quickly get your arms around the challenge, but we find that in all situations. So if you're looking at one that has happened and feeling like, man, we're late to the party, we didn't realize, it's common. It's sometimes necessary. In other cases, it just gets looked past. But in all four scenarios, IT is often forgotten about until we really have to get into the work of bringing those two organizations to their either their separation or merged eventuality. And we'll talk about that and how that looks. But that, if you're feeling that way, it's common for all four of these scenarios.
Well said, Kurt. Okay, so also want to give you a little bit of perspective. If you have been through an M&A life cycle, awesome. If this may be some review for you, if you haven't been through it, I want to give you some perspective of what that typically looks like. So if you got one that's like, oh man, we've got one coming down the road, or you've never been through it before, it's a little bit of a step-by-step of what this typically looks like. So the first step of this is when a company says, hey, I'm going to do an acquisition. Let's just kind of stick in the acquisition space for a second. They are doing some pre-assessment, sort of poking around, right? It's very like hush hush most of the time, but they are doing some pre-assessment. But what needs to exist at that point is they're either doing it without any real guidebook, and they're asking some questions, but they're not asking others. And oftentimes they get through that stage without having really done the kinds of investigation that they should have done because they weren't ready. This is a spot where really effective IT organizations have established, and not just IT organizations even, but like the business organization itself has established a playbook for M&A success, especially organizations that have done this well. Highly functioning organizations have said, this is our playbook we take off the shelf. Every time we start investigating a new organization that's going to be part of our greater family, we are going to go through these sets of questions. We're going to get this information even before due diligence. so we can perform this pre-assessment activity. So this is a space where having the playbook, having a roadmap activity early on arms you to be able to do this well. The organizations we've seen this do 6, 7, 8 times, they have that off-the-shelf asset that they bring to the table to be able to do that recurringly. After you get through that first phase, you move into things like due diligence, where there's already a statement that this organization is going to be acquired. It's been sort of put out on the street. But when that gets put out on the street, there's an activity to perform a formal due diligence of the transaction. So they're going to ask some very specific questions, but they only get some very short periods of time to be able to ask those questions. So further leveraging a playbook to make sure the right questions are answered early on is really important. Also, having strategy firms engaged that can provide the independent assessment is usually used at this point. So then you move into close, and there's a decision made. And then when you hit that close, there's a very specific set of expectations that are placed upon the business. Usually there's a TSA day, which is a period where after you've decided to acquire or spin off an organization, there's an agreement between the organizations that after this date, there's going to be financial penalties because of having to support certain apps or certain parts of the network. And up until that point, there's an agreement that there's going to be a sharing of costs or a cost model that's non-penalization. It's essentially like we're working together. So based on that date, you're then defining your execution activity. And this is really where this identity story hits the road. You're in the point where you're saying, oh, I've got to bring this organization into my organization, or I need to spin off this part of my business because there's a date. And after that date, we're done. So this is where you're really the extent to which you can move fast because you understand your destination technical state and you understand how you're going to make it real is super important. Like if you hit that spot and you haven't got all that prepared, you're just like, you're having to do it then. And it really adds stress to the picture. So your goal at that stage is get the integration done or get the divestiture done. And the organizations that do this really well, they minimize the amount of tech debt that they leave behind because there's funding at this spot. The integration comes along with funding to be able to optimize the environment. If you cheap out there, you're going to be left holding the bag later and then have to go clean it up potentially without the funding that you actually need. So this is the spot where you are going to get that funding, and the place that you prepare it is actually up here to say, when we do mergers, this is the kind of funding I'm going to need. And then after that, you get into providing value creation. And to a certain extent, the extent to which you can do value creation is based on how well you limited tech debt early on. Like I'm talking with organizations that still have their separate identity environments. Well, with separate identity environments really limits the extent to which you can do value creation across those two organizations. So Kurt, you've been involved in all these stages. How would you tack on to this?
Yeah, some of what you said about that TSA and really what types of deadlines do we have to hit really plays a very active role in these types of integrations. And I think planning for that and seeing the types of steps we need to take along the way to plan for a timeline and what that looks like. In some cases, we're involved right when the action is happening. In other cases, in that scenario we talked about earlier, sometimes acquisitions are made and the technology is left alone. In all of the situations, that end game of value creation, there's still opportunity there. We talk to many organizations who have acquired businesses over 4 or 5, sometimes 10 years, and look at it and say, wait a second, there's a better way of doing this. It might be an opportunity to bring the users together in disparate business units that are now one company but don't really act like it. There's value there, getting people talking to each other, getting customers talking to each other. And in other situations, the value creation is really, there's a massive efficiency that can be gained for an organization just to move faster through things, do things with less cost. Even if it is late in the game, and it is, that survey Nate did at the beginning, where the acquisition maybe happened years ago or the divestiture happened years ago, the not addressing the technology needs related to M&A, there's still the opportunity to create some of that value, even if that pressure of the immediate transaction doesn't exist. And I would invite anybody who's looking at challenges like this to ask, okay, where do we stand to extract value from these disparate business units and technology entities being well designed, architected, and working together? Because no matter where you are in the cycle, that value creation can exist. It might look a little different. There might be a different timeline that you need to follow or challenges that you need to prioritize first, but there's value at any stage that you find, a scenario like this. In the case of the TSA, the live transaction, there's going to be deadlines that you just absolutely have to hit to create the separation. But even when that has passed, there's value to be created.
Yeah, well said, Kurt. Okay, so before we get to some of the identity consolidation piece, I want to give you some tips on establishing operating principles as you get into building out your identity strategy. So as we thought about mergers and acquisitions, especially in the context of identity, but also broader than that, we established operating principles that are part of that story. And a way to think about an M&A and identity in this context is to say this is probably the most complex IT project that the organization will ever go through, because they're having to move everything that IT, think, traditional IT, right? Identity, collaboration, communication, data center identity, servers, apps, file servers, all of that stuff needs to get either spun off or moved in. And that encompasses the attention of the entire organization, let alone like having to move the ERP system and everything else that it's tied to. So when you're thinking about going through this process, these are things that we think most about. Would be first, reducing the time to value of the spin itself or the acquisition itself. Second, mitigating the interruption of production. That particularly comes into play as we're thinking about the identity consolidation or activities surrounding it. The third is using this as an opportunity to mitigate security risks. This is a spot where you really don't want to bring in trash into your environment or build a new environment that brings the security risks along with it. This is a spot where you can mitigate some of those problems that you have within the environment as you are doing the migration. Fourth, there's an opportunity to modernize where it's reasonable. This isn't like re-architecting entire applications. There's never enough time for that. But sometimes there's time to like move off of a Horizon VMware environment to AVD, or move from the Windows Active Directory to Entra ID. This is the spot where it's as fast to do that as it is to replace it with the legacy technology. So look at this as an opportunity to be able to gain that modernization while you're going through the process. Fifth, gain efficiencies in the end state environment, kind of tied to the modernization, but just broadly. And then sixth, this is an opportunity to build new value. And you really can't do that unless you've accomplished these other things first. So we're going to talk about 4 tenant integration options. The first 2 are a little bit more traditional, and some of the others are not. So the first one, you've probably already seen some scenarios around, is merging the tenants into a new identity. This would be like a scenario where I've got 2 tenants. They are part of my organization now, or even multiple tenants, like not just 2. And my opportunity is to move that into a brand new identity that takes the advantage to be able to clean up the environment. That every organization considers. Sometimes they choose to do it, and other times they choose not to, and they're like, oh, I wish I would have built that new identity. So this is sort of scenario 1. Scenario 2 is merging tenants into an existing identity. Okay, so like I've got a parent identity environment. I'm acquiring a company of 500 users. My parent is 10,000. I'm going to move that new acquisition into my new tenant. So that would be that scenario. The next would be not merging the tenants as an end state. So like I'm intentionally not merging the tenants, but I'm integrating them with each other. And there's some reasons why you might go down that path. And then the fourth is I'm not merging the tenants, but I am using this as an opportunity to establish a new identity master that everything integrates with, that establishes this sort of new parent. So we'll talk about each of these. So we're going to start by talking about the scenarios of merging the tenants. And this is the most sort of traditional approach to this problem. It's not, I don't say traditional in a sense of it being legacy. I just mean it's like the one we've been doing for 20 years. So in this environment, we're going to talk about like even SMTP integration first. You have organization 1, you have organization 2. Both organizations are of diverse sizes. They could be equal, they could be smaller, but the assumption of option 1 is, they're big enough and important enough that we're going to establish a new parent organization. We're going to build a new Entra AD. It's going to have its own Office 365. It's going to have its own Intune, own Azure tenant, Windows AD, everything. We're going to build this new organization. So imagine like one is 10K users, another is 10K users, and they're like, I'd really like to establish this new identity that everything moves into so we can build a plan together to create a better organization. And these other domains become like resource domains and things we can lean on, but our new identity is this new space. In order to facilitate that, you are establishing a mail flow mechanism like Quest between the two email environments. So then what this kind of looks like from an identity standpoint is you still have the Windows AD trust, you have Windows AD trust, you have Windows AD trust between the organizations. All these servers exist in one org, they exist in the other org, and there's a migration process to get them into that destination. But in order to facilitate that over a sort of period of time, what you're doing is you're using a tool like Quest to be able to facilitate that migration of the users and the devices, but you're also using a tool like Quest to be able to facilitate the SMTP routing across the environment. So it could, because you needed all to coexist at the same time. You might have a scenario where you're like moving users partway from one and partway to the other at different points of time. Like it's not like a flash migration. We're always organizing this in terms of waves. So this is probably the most like, if I was merging two organizations together of equal sizes and both were kind of messes, this is our best scenario, right? Like if we had all the funding and all the timeline in the world, we would want to move to a new environment that both leave the old, they both move to the new, and the new environment becomes this sort of new establishment of what it means to be a consolidated company. This is what you do when you do a spinoff, because you're building that new company from the ground up. But oftentimes in mergers, companies don't want to go down quite as significant of a path. So they pick option 2. So option 2 is a scenario where you have an organization and there's this partner organization and you're bringing that business into the other org. And as a component of bringing that business into the other org, one of them becomes a master. You have a domain trust, a Windows AD domain trust between the environments. And then you're facilitating the movement. And there's some scenarios where you wouldn't have that domain trust. You're facilitating the movement of the users, the devices, and the server environment from organization 1 to organization 2. And that is another area where you're going to use something like a Quest to facilitate the migration activity for the users and devices together, and then the server environment that would follow it. I'm going to pause here for a second. Kurt, any kind of extra comments around either of these two scenarios?
No, I think you hit on a couple of key things relative to the planning of the organizations and where a lot of the work goes into understanding which option we're going to use. It gets down to understanding the logical groupings of a business and in an organization here, and that's what's led us to select the the Quest tooling that we really believe is key to it. It helps us leverage organizations where they're at, and organizing logical groupings of users to migrate in a fashion that makes sense for the organization. But we'll go into it, I think, a little bit later. That planning is one of the key things that can make or break a migration, whether it's option one or it's this option two, is you do have to be thinking about at what point are we going to be synchronizing information and or merging that information across the tool set. And for us, we stand behind it. Quest has become a great tool. We'll get some of our key admins on the call from our side that have partnered in leveraging Quest. We feel like we've got kind of best of breed tooling to do that. But the process piece of it in either option, very critical to understand when we should be synchronizing data and how we should be organizing logical groupings, business units, geography, types of work that have specific work hours. All those things play a role in determining when do we want to be syncing, when is the right time to be performing cutover or migration activities. But all that planning, I can't emphasize enough. It ends up being core to being successful on executing these projects.
Yeah, perfect. So I wanted to give you a couple like option one, option two in the context of this sort of typical migration pattern. The first of these is, do I combine workstations in collaboration or do I do them separately? And typically you are combining parts of collaboration together, and then some other parts might vary. The goal should be to knock out as much of this environment together as possible. So like what I wouldn't want to do is just move collaboration and then have this like long tail of the workstation replacement that is tied to them moving over to the new domain. That creates a pretty disjointed, inconsistent user experience. I've seen a lot of companies try it and do it, but it becomes pretty problematic. So it's one to like, if you're going to do it, really understand the user experience problems that come with disjointing the collaboration and workstation migration. Option one is about taking a user that logs onto a PC. They move from environment one to environment two. And when they do that move, we're doing as much work to pair things like their OneDrive and their email and other parts of this together as closely as possible, so they have a great user experience when they move. And sometimes that means they move in like waves. Kurt said, well, they move in waves that are like very much tied to the other people that they're interacting with, which can be tricky. And it also, because sometimes it's pretty diverse, it also requires a little longer upfront phase to make sure you get a great user experience in the migration. So sometimes it can feel like you're doing a lot of prep work, and then you hit these first couple migrations and they're sometimes a little rocky, but you're doing that work to get to a point where like your main migration waves have a great user experience. And that option one tends to be the one that's the most recommended. The second part of this is like, how do I move the workstation? Am I resetting it or am I migrating it? So an option can be to completely autopilot reset the devices as they move into a new environment. Their content's already in OneDrive, user experience goes back to default. Sometimes I've seen, a kind of partner to this option is like, we just shipped everybody 25 new PCs at that site. Like, we're not even like migrating the device. We're just shipping them a new device, and we move their content. And for certain types of migrations, that's a great option. Like, especially smaller ones, you don't have to worry about migrating the device. You just ship your standard kit to them. But what's in larger migrations, what's a little bit more typical is you're retaining the device and you're moving the user profile and apps and everything over to the new destination. And for that, you typically need a tool like a Quest to facilitate that migration. So that ends up being the more typical migration pattern for a larger organization. And then for the smaller acquisitions, you tend to just ship them PCs. Okay. So then we get to like, what do I do with the joining of the desktops? And I'm sorry, it still says Azure AD. I mean, Entra ID. So option one is we're going to make those devices Entra ID joined and cloud managed. That is our end game. Why is that highly recommended? Is because that is no longer just sort of like something that's sort of on the roadmap that we should get to at some point. This is the way you should be managing and delivering identity to end user computing devices, full stop. Like if you haven't started a path to move down to Entra ID joined devices, cloud managed, and you're still kind of hanging out on configuration manager, this is a good opportunity for you to start that movement, especially with devices you're bringing into the environment so you don't create additional tech debt. So even when you are cloud joined for Entra ID and not hybrid joined, you can still authenticate against local resources. That's sometimes a little bit of a fear, uncertainty, and doubt associated with using cloud joined devices that creeps in. You can still like interact with an on-premise file server and authenticate to it. So that is still there, but then you release the device from its dependency on the on-premise environment, and it even gets to a point where you don't even necessarily always have to have it VPN'd in, because as they move to more SaaS-oriented applications and cloud identity, you get to a point where that device is truly able to sort of work on its own. So that's your gold standard. That we found has gotten better and better. It used to be pretty dicey to move a device from cloud join, sort of hybrid join to cloud joined, and that process has gotten a lot easier as the tooling has emerged. And then option two is the sort of hybrid joined AD desktop. This is like having your foot in both camps, and it doesn't people would think, oh, hybrid, like that makes it easier to get to the end option. Unfortunately, it really doesn't. There is not a good way to move without tooling to move from hybrid join to Entra ID join only. So you will be essentially doing a double migration, which is at this point something I would just highly avoid. So option one is not even just kind of a recommended; it's a strong recommended. It's a highly recommended. Kurt, you've lived this process. How has this gotten better over time?
Yeah, over time, I think one of the things that you're able to do is look at each user's scenario or each application and understand how are people accessing that information, and the tooling here. I mean, we go way back. We're talking about a single identity on a single domain, and everything needs to be in one space. Using some of the nature of hybrid join desktops and what we can do with virtual desktops allows users to be in more than one place at once, if you will. But that requires some planning. It can get complicated, but it can actually get things to go faster. That would be the biggest benefit of some of the modern tooling that we see. We have the ability to get users working against maybe the current environment while they're moving to the new in ways that we didn't previously, and that's one of the benefits. But then ultimately, we find ourselves in a position where at some point you do need to make some decisions about cutting ties with the old and moving to the new. But that temporary state being available can be really useful, that you talked about. It can be really useful as you're working through the progression, because these are rarely going to be light switch events where you go from point A to point B overnight. And the technology that you emphasize really allows an organization to take the pace in some of these in-between states where in previous iterations in tooling, you kind of had to design a light switch event. Fortunately, that's not the case. But at the same time, you do have to figure out what your end state looks like and march towards that. So it's really about moving faster, but also being able to move through some of those intermediate events that happen through any M&A event or any post-acquisition consolidation activity.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. Okay. The last one here, very interesting part of the story that keeps, and this is going to play right into the next section, is how integration tooling options have evolved over time. So the tried and true migration option is to use some tooling like Quest, ShareGate to facilitate the migration from one environment to the other, especially when you need to support the same user's email domain between two different tenants, and you need to sort of individually migrate users and content from one to the other, and pre-stage content, so when the user gets there, their stuff is already there. All that stuff needs to go quietly well with the organization, and the way you do that is by pre-staging, being able to test it, being able to flip people between the environments cleanly, and the ability to be able to take one user at a time as necessary. So using a tool like Quest or ShareGate sometimes feels like, oh man, I got to pay that extra like license fee. It's totally worth it to be able to get to that end game. Now, Microsoft has started to establish some tools of their own. And these provide, I'd say right now, more integration than they do migration. There's migration capabilities, but more integration than they are migration. Especially if you're a large multinational, multi-tenant organization that has a whole diversity of environments that you're not sure you're going to keep, like, or you want them to function on their own, or even after acquiring them, you want to limit the amount of time it takes them to be able to get to like interacting with your team, right? You want to facilitate high degrees of interaction while still having the confidence that the environment you're interacting with is secure. So sometimes using the Microsoft native tools might be an initial option to facilitate later migration. And I would expect this to get more sophisticated over time as sort of Microsoft knows that like, oh man, like I need to kind of provide more and more of this capability out of box in a certain sense. You're going to see Microsoft's capabilities continue to advance. But as it stands today, the like scenarios we just talked about, like a full scale migration, you're going to be using a Quest and ShareGate tools for that kind of project. Okay, so let's move into distributed tenant options. Again, if you have any questions, drop them in the chat. That question that just came through is really great. Appreciate it. So distributed tenant options, what do we mean by that? Well, one question that's come up in some businesses that we worked with is, do we even consolidate? Like, is that providing us a value to the business? So something that you can take advantage of is called multi-tenant management. It essentially is a way to integrate different tenants. What I mean by tenants, meaning like Office 365 tenants, okay? Different tenants with each other, while allowing those organizations to securely communicate, providing some security policy guidance across the tenants to make sure certain things are in place, but then essentially allowing those tenants to work and function on their own as independent businesses. So organizations that have like that are like a parent of companies, like I own company 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and I have no intent of ever integrating them. I have no value in bringing them together as a business, but they're part of like my sort of company holding organization, and I want to allow them to maybe have this ability to collaborate with each other, maybe sell across my products. Maybe I'm going to integrate certain parts of the identity, but at the whole, like the IT level, I might want to spin this other company off later. So I'm not necessarily going to suck it in. I want it to be its own organization. So multi-tenant management facilitates that idea. It allows for organizations to sort of have that relationship. But this is truly, you have to understand, this is truly at the Office 365 Entra ID tenant level. This is not the Windows Active Directory. Of course, you could do trusts, but at that point, you might as well start integrating. This is at the Office 365 tenant level, but for many businesses, that's totally sufficient. So what you're doing is you're establishing a B2B connection between your tenant and this other tenant. And it establishes a mutual trust between the tenants. So things like teams can share channels, they can collaborate, they can You can ensure that like I have one governance across the environments that enforces certain policies. And I, as an overall security organization, I can apply these controls to ensure that these things exist. Why is that super important? Well, that's one of the biggest reasons why companies do consolidation is I want to collaborate with the other tenants that I have, and I want to ensure that they're secure. Well, as you start leveraging some of these Microsoft Cloud capabilities, the need to consolidate just to accomplish that gets a little bit mitigated. Not that like the legacy environment doesn't have to get dealt with, but if those environments are somewhat independent to begin with, you're going to likely have some possibilities where you could leave them on their own. But even if you're just using this to kind of shorten the time frame for collaboration, it's a win. So like if you said, okay, cool, we eventually want to consolidate this company we acquired into our environment, and we're getting funding for it, man, don't let that loss. Like if you're doing an acquisition, get the money so you can actually do the integration if you want to accomplish that, because there's that like impetus to do it. But your short-term opportunity is, hey, I could connect these two tenants and people can start collaborating on teams tomorrow as part of the integration activity. So this is truly an option for organizations to be able to look at short-term and long-term if it fits the business need. So what does this provide? Here is a long list of what it provides and what it doesn't. So what it provides, you can collaborate between organizations with teams. They can act and feel as though they are part of the same organization, even though they are not. You can interconnect calendars and coordinate as though you are in the same organization. You can share content between OneDrive, SharePoint, Teams that are tenants. And then you can get roll-up of your cloud metrics and cloud security capabilities and health across the entire environment. So there's quite a bit that provides. But what doesn't it do? This is probably the more important part of the question. So the owner tenant still doesn't really have complete control. You would need to delineate that control, provide that control across those tenants for that owner. There are still some security controls that are based on those individual tenants. It doesn't establish Windows Active Directory trust, and then maybe that's a benefit actually. Most organizations are pretty cautious to enable those Active Directory trusts, the Windows Active Directory trust. So it allows that collaboration to happen in a little bit of a lower stakes environment to a degree, because you're not doing all the rest of that legacy integration. File server, legacy collaboration still on its own. This might be an opportunity to say, you know what? Our file servers are only for archive for both organizations. We're going to ship it out to an Azure holding spot, or we're going to put the file servers on archive and everything goes into Teams and OneDrive. Like, it can be a moment where you pivot that to the modern environment. Application sharing is still going to be mitigated, especially legacy applications, right? Networks and data centers are still segmented, and the identity provisioning is still separate. So you have to ask yourself the question, do I care about these things? Because you might not. Like, you might be in an environment where I'm like, cool, man, like I can collaborate, email them, and all these things, but they're really a separate organization. Keep them on their own. Or it might be, no, I need all this. This is like, we want them to be one business. We want them to feel like one business. And, you know, we want to be able to tackle these items.
Yeah, Nate, I'll jump in here. A big deal, and I think Mary Jo in the chat had a comment related to this. Those two bullets really in the middle around file server, like legacy collaboration, and then the next one, application sharing. Really, really important that you wrap your arms around the challenge before you start to consider multi-tenant and how the cross-tenant functionality exists. Because at the end of the day, the environments do remain segregated in that world. And what we find working with a lot of customers, there's so much legacy file share and or application dependency that lives inside that existing tenant, that before you would consider multi-tenant, some of the configuration that we talked about, reconciling what are the core applications and who will need to use them in the post event state, divestiture or acquisition, becomes really, really important. So in situations where you've got legacy homegrown applications that require a lot of intricate integrations or interdependency amongst files, other applications, data stores, it's really important you get your arms around that before you consider, cross-tenant functionality. That's one of the things that as we get into unpacking these types of projects with clients, it's where it can get sticky, because maybe it's two different departments will begin using the same application together for the first time. Maybe it's one department can no longer have access to that information as the nature of the business divestiture event plays out. But inventorying the legacy collaboration, the file shares, and the applications themselves can help you make this decision. Those two pieces are really, really critical, because the last thing you want is to have expectations that you go multi-tenant, new business, should be able to access application XYZ, and then they can't because it just happens to be in a different scenario. You may find yourself in a world where you have to re-architect that application. It might be a better situation to actually merge and follow through on more of the traditional migration type approach that Nate covered earlier.
All right. So to give some perspective on what even this kind of integration might look like, you may end up having a couple diverse options here, right? So like you may have a scenario where you have 5 tenants, 5 client tenants, and one becomes sort of the de facto master where you're integrating those tenants. The other option might be you establish a new, it's called the Genesis tenant, like the new tenant, and it then integrates with everything else as the new master. Both can work. I see more companies go on the sort of the one side than the two side, just because of like one tenant already exists. But it's like one of those things where like if you miss that opportunity to establish something new, you always sort of have that what if of like, what if I was able to go do that new thing? And usually that's associated with tying the pain that the business is going through real time to the initiative that's going to make that pain least least painful, like not just short term to establish and deal with the email collaboration problem, but long term to kind of clean up the tech debt that comes along with the merger. So that's really where like IT leadership needs to be pretty loud to make sure that you get what's going to serve you well long term and not just leave the problems around for some later point. So where do the people start usually? They're usually integrating. We showed that. And then one thing I wanted to hit on is this sort of idea of Google integration. Like what, like sometimes it's not all Office 365. Well, the problem with the Google integration scenarios is there's not really a good way to facilitate cross-tenant integration. It's like Google non-integration, frankly. And that's not saying anything negative about Google specifically. It's just that these are very different environments to work in. So we find that not only is Google to Office 365 like long-term coexistence really a great option, but it also, not only is it not a great option, it also is probably the most significant organizational change management thing to work through as you pivot them into the new environment. So like as a Google environment moves over, you're going to be switching out their tools, their desktop, the way you manage their desktop. Usually a lot of times those Google environments, especially smaller ones, like their work group joined, their complete like messes in terms of how they're managed from a security perspective. Not that all the Office 365 environments are perfect either, but like they tend to be pretty diverse. So I find a little bit more risk in those environments short term, but also a need to deal with the OCM aspect of the integration. Kurt, any perspective on the sort of Google side of bringing them into the Office 365 tenant?
It often ends up being smaller organizations, smaller footprints of users. And I think when you get to scale sometimes you do simply just end up in a greenfield. And as we say operationally, sometimes it's you're looking at a small swath of users that you may just observe and treat as if you have a new hiring class of 10 or 15, 20 users. A lot of times when we're seeing Google, it's not at scale. And I think the wise, practical thing to look at is just, is this an opportunity where we could do some very simple file migration and work through things and effectively start from scratch with a data migration? That's what we find most common in these Google scenarios, but each one is unique. There are organizations that are using Google at scale. If you happen to be one of those, let us know. There are some creative things that we can do, but what we see most typically is that organizations grow out of Google, and we're usually able to come up with some pretty quick solutions that are effectively treating those organizations with new deployments in really kind of a fresh start, and then migrate only what you need type attitude. That works really well and can be very, very quick to get organizations that have leveraged Google on board with a more mature and more robust M365 platform.
Well said. Okay, so a couple little things to finish here before we are out of time. I want to give you, if you go down the consolidation route, especially across the board, remember, this is the most significant IT project you will probably ever do. Here's the kinds of things that you're going to be thinking about as you do that project, because they need to be done. And in most cases, it's the right move, because you need to have a cybersecurity, identity, collaboration, end user computing, data center, network, and application environment that has operationalized and consolidated capabilities that you can manage as an organization, especially as they feel like one business. You don't want to be in a situation, unless you're really running separate companies that are integrated with each other, that you don't want to be in a situation where like you have not had the opportunity to truly get your hands around the managed environment, or you're going to be coming back later to do the same thing, which unfortunately, when you come back later to do the same thing, it's usually tied to some sort of event that got you funding and momentum. Like you had one of the environments was compromised, or they can't communicate or collaborate, or they're inefficient because you have different IT teams dealing with them all. And that sort of point in time situation reignites that this is a problem. So better to deal with it early on than later on. So each of these domains needs to get thought about, put into a work stream, planned, and then an organization built around how these are going to be built into waves. Oftentimes, you're doing your sort of safe plan, you're establishing your identity, you're moving these together, and then access to the network and data center becomes part of the picture, as part of all of this is. But then having access to the applications for users that are migrated and users that are not migrated, and then moving the app, all is kind of interweaving, stevedoring of the pieces of the environment. All of this needs to be taken into consideration. So these are some tools that you will probably end up using as part of your migration. We talked about Quest. That's certainly something that you take advantage of in most organizations. ShareGate, pretty common. Some companies already have that in place because they use it for SharePoint management. Things like Azure Migrate and Storage Mover come into play as you are taking environment data, servers, and you're migrating that to the cloud. I didn't really talk much about that, but that's one of the things that happens very often in these projects is you're not only merging, you're also trying to mitigate threats and probably close data centers as part of the merger or spinoff. So you are using tools to be able to move them into a cloud environment that you can trust because you built it and you secured it and you microsegmented it and you implemented your modern standards in and around it. So those tend to come into play. And then what we've tended to do, and we don't kind of run out of time to talk a lot about this, but we've built a tool called the Automator that helps facilitate the wave planning between all these migrations. Okay, so how do we get organized? First is have a clear environment horizon plan. What do I mean by that? I mean, know what the destination environment you intend looks like. Many organizations go through this path and they just move them into the existing tech debt rather than having a frame of the destination environment. They want not only the merged environment to arrive at, but also the environment that they have today, right? I've got an environment now. I want it to get to this modern state. Skip over where you are now for the people you're merging in, get them to that modern state to the extent to which you can. So frame your integration to facilitate that migration to the horizon plan. Build your playbook in advance that helps you to organize your plan to get to organize your journey to that new horizon, but also helps you prepare for these M&As early on. Number 4, don't underestimate cost or timeline. Oh my gosh, like you already have a TSA probably, but if it's an old environment, don't underestimate how significant of an effort this is and how much it will be all encompassing. And then finally, set those clear expectations. Expect pushback from leadership. They will give you unreasonable expectations for your execution. Even the TSAs will feel like it is impossible. They are possible oftentimes, but sometimes you need to provide that sort of clear pushback to say, no, I can't have your email integrated in 2 weeks. Like, just not going to happen. So you need to be able to provide that pushback. Kurt, any other learnings from this before we go to our action items?
You know, the don't underestimate, it can't be said enough. There really is no such thing as simple when you're starting to talk about integrating 2 businesses and organizations from a technology standpoint. And I think the organizations that go through recurring M&A or divestitures, acquisitions, they build up that muscle to understand that, and giving the respect to evaluate and plan how this is going to impact each and every user and workflow you have in your organization is very, very critical. And that's where you can get to that playbook. But oftentimes we see clients that you just stumble over it the first time. You see customers that maybe make an assumption that this will be easy. They're doing it pretty close to the same way we are, but every business, every department is unique. And investing in the planning to get your arms around the business problems that you're actually solving by bringing the organizations together is really critical in the early stages. You plan right, you can run downhill. You don't, and it becomes a challenging opportunity when you're against a timeline. It can be very tricky.
Yeah, well said. Okay, so we just hit the tip of the iceberg here, but what we would love to do is do an identity environment envisioning session with all of you, well, individually with each company. I think you'd find a ton of value in that. We would offer that as an investment from Concurrency to do that envisioning session. The goal of this is to gain strategic insights and risk analysis for your environment, but also have a little bit of additional information on what a consolidation environment or decision-making process would look like. So that's sort of thing one. We would love to have that conversation with you. And then second would be, you might be in a situation where you're trying to do a lot of M&As. Like you see like 3, 4, 5 coming up this year, and you want to build a customized guide to be able to do that well and streamline it in your business. So we can help you build that M&A playbook. If that's something interesting, definitely let us know. We have a template to bring to the table to help get you started and getting going faster on that. So both of these I think are really valuable, especially number 1 is like a very tactical, let's get engaged. And number 2 as a let's do something really strategic to position ourselves for what's coming in the future. So really appreciate everyone's time being part of the session today. Oh, okay. Oh, yes, Mary Jo, thank you for asking that question. Any tips on how to talk to Microsoft and avoid paying for 2 Microsoft M365 licenses? Yes. So where that comes into play is if you have to have a migration plan. So like if you have 2 environments, this might be telling you something you already know, but like if you have 2 environments and you're trying to bring them together, Microsoft will give you a like free license period where you won't have to double pay. It's a bridge agreement where you can bring the environment over to the destination environment for a period of time. I've found those to last from like 3 months to like sometimes up to 6 months, but usually 3 is the main period that you get. So if you want some help kind of navigating that, happy to help you out. Any other questions? Awesome. Well, I know we're at the top of the hour. Thank you so much. Great conversation with you all today. Thank you for taking time. And make sure you let us know which of those follow-ups you'd like to engage in.
Thanks, everyone.